Hello and welcome to Spellbook by the Letters, your weekly guide to the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition spellbook in alphabetical order. Like every week, we have 7 spells that we're going to be talking about here today, so without further ado, why don't we just jump on in? Our first spell that we're going to talk about here today is Calm Emotions. Calm Emotions is a Bard Cleric spell, and it reads as thus. Second level enchantment, casting time 1 action, range 60 feet, vocal somatic components, and a duration of concentration up to a minute. It has within the range of 60 feet, you choose a 20-foot radius sphere centered on a point within range, and all creatures have to make a charisma saving throw. Creatures can choose to fail that save if they wish. Upon that, you choose one of 2 effects. You can suppress any charmed or frightened condition that the creature is under, or you can make the target indifferent about creatures that it is hostile toward. If it is attacked or harmed by a spell or anything else, or if it witnesses any of its friends being harmed, the spell ends for that creature. So this is a pretty good spell. Let's talk about the components first. I think for Calm Emotions, it's just got to be something like a shh, 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 shh. Just everybody calm down. Just, you are the peacekeeper. You are the person that is telling the crowd that it's going to be okay. For the rating, I think this is a pretty solid spell. I don't think that one of these as a second level spell is okay. It's not great. It's decent rate. If it was one of these halves, I wouldn't like this spell as much, but it's a fantastic modal spell. You have 2 pretty decent options in one spell known or one spell prepared, and 2 options that fulfill different roles. So having those 2 options at your fingertip for one spell known or prepared is what makes Calm Emotions solid. And for who should be casting it, both the Bard, who has limited spells known, so Calm Emotions is good there, and the Cleric, who has to pick a certain number of spells prepared per day, and you have some room for some situational stuff, but having 2 situational spells in one makes it all the better for the Cleric to pick up as well. Not going to be super useful in every single instance, but having both modes, you at least are going to find some mileage out of this spell on most days. Our next spell that we're talking about is Chain Lightning. Chain Lightning is a sorcerer wizard spell, and it reads as thus. It is a 6th level evocation, a casting time of 1 action, a range of 150 feet, vocal, somatic, and material components, and a duration of instantaneous. And it reads as thus. You create a bolt of lightning that arcs toward a target, and then the 3 bolts off of that arc towards targets within 30 feet of that original target. Each creature has to make a dexterity save, and it does 10d8 lightning damage, or half that, on a successful save. So pretty solid damage. And then you can upcast the spell. For each level above 6th, you choose an additional target for the spell. So you can hit 4 people total within that range on a first level, or on a 6th level spell, and then you can hit 5 on a 7th, 6 on an 8th, and so on. Overall, it's a decent rate for the damage. It is better on a wizard that doesn't have a careful spell. Otherwise, on a sorcerer, Fireball is almost as good. Not quite as good. The damage isn't quite as good. Fireball can hit more targets, though. But you're hitting everything, whereas you can be surgical with Chain Lightning. Fireball does an average of 37 damage when cast at 6th level. Chain Lightning will do an average of 45 damage when cast at this level, with maximums of 80 and a minimum of 10 on Chain Lightning, with Fireball at 6th level having a maximum of 66 and a minimum of 11. So even this has a higher average damage, a slightly lower floor, and a higher ceiling. So the damage is better, and it's a less resisted damage type, So overall, if you're looking for a damage spell, Chain Lightning is a pretty solid pickup. And for the components for Chain Lightning, I think something like Zap. Very simple for a very powerful spell. Our next spell that we're going to be talking about is Charm Person. Charm Person is a Bard, Druid, Sorcerer, Warlock, Wizard spell, and it reads as thus. First level enchantment, casting time of 1 action, range of 30 feet, components vocal and somatic, a duration of 1 hour, no concentration required. And you attempt to charm a humanoid within range, makes a wisdom saving throw, and does so with advantage if you or your companions are fighting it. If it fails the saving throw, it is charmed by you until the spell ends, or until you or your companions do anything harmful to it. The charmed creature regards you as a friendly acquaintance. Once the spell ends, the target knows that it has been charmed. You can upcast for an additional target each level. All targets must be within 30 feet of each other. I very much like this spell. It's a really, really solid pickup for any of these classes. It's just one of those classic solid spells. For the components, I think, so there is a vocal component to Charm Person. I think that should be weaved into like saying something nice to the person, because the person obviously doesn't realize that you're charming them. So I think that the vocal component's just like, oh, how you doing, old friend? And the somatic component is like a clasp on the back or like finger guns, because it can be at range. But yeah, it's really solid. You do need to know that this is not a spell to make you some long-term friends or to get you off on the right foot with some powerful people or people that you're going to need to rely on again. This is a spell that helps you easily make social encounters that you're not going to have to look at the ramifications too much again on. So say you need into a club or into some place that's guarded. You walk up to a friend and be like, hey, how you doing, buddy? Haven't seen you in years. Charm Person. They're now charmed. Now you might have an in to persuade them to let you buy. Needing a little discount from a shopkeeper that you haven't seen again in a long time. Hey, shopkeep, how's it going? You're going to be out of the town within the next day. You charm them. You maybe get a 10% discount on your stuff for being an old friend. And you get out. For things like, hey, this is somebody important in a town that we're going to be dealing with for a while, don't charm them. You're going to make an enemy later on. They're going to know that you charmed them, and things are going to go downhill for you quickly. So it's a spell that, while good, you have to be careful with. Our next spell that we're going to be talking about is what is, I'm going to say, the second best damage cantrip in the game. And I do not say that lightly, at least for Player's Handbook spells. There have been some spells like Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade and Toll the Dead that kind of push those limits a little bit. But as far as Player's Handbook spells go, this next spell is the best one. It is a Sorcerer, Warlock, Wizard spell, and it is Chill Touch. Chill Touch is a necromancy cantrip. Casting time of 1 action, a beautiful range of 120 feet, vocal and somatic components, duration of 1 round. You create a ghostly skeletal hands and a space of a creature within range, and you make your ranged spell attack. On a hit, the target takes a d8 of necrotic damage. And until the start of your next turn, it can't regain hit points. Until then, the hand clings to the target. If you hit an undead target, that target has disadvantage on all attack rolls that it makes against you until the start of your next turn. Until the end of your next turn. Sorry, this one, that effect goes until the end of your next turn. And then damage scales as typical cantrip damage does at 2d8 at 5th, 3d8 at 11th, and 4d8 at 17th. This spell is amazing. It's one of those spells that I look at and I'm like, okay, that's solid, but the more that I've seen it in action and the more that I've played with it, the more that I have fallen in love with it. It does solid damage at a d8 for single target. That's not as high as something like Firebolt. It is about 1 damage on average lower than Firebolt. And it definitely does not compete in damage-wise with Eldritch Blast, which is, again, 1 damage plus Charisma if you're playing the Blast Lock per bolt. So Eldritch Blast is, especially if you get your Charisma to the damage, going to outdamage this cantrip by far. But the utility, the subtle utility of this spell is so good, and you cannot overlook it. So it is, 1, it's going to hamper undead from attacking you. Undead are a pretty common creature type and a pretty nasty creature type. So, boom. That's solid on a sorcerer, warlock, or wizard. 2, it prevents any form of healing. Pesky regeneration that you don't know how to deal with? Boom. This takes care of it. You have an enemy that has pretty strong just healing spells and powers? Boom. This takes care of it. And a recent example of what I saw that uses this spell in really creative ways is the Spectral Hand is visible and it clings to the target, but it's not like an item that the target is carrying. So if it's an invisible creature's gear and stuff turns invisible with them. But the Spectral Hand will still be visible. It will not make the creature visible, but it does give you and your allies an incredible idea about where they are. So there aren't like, just, I'm invisible, I can just move around to the other side of you, you're not sure where I am. That Spectral Hand is at least going to get you attacking that right square, that right general area, so you're not just completely missing on attacks, you're only getting that disadvantage and not attacking squares where they're not even at. So it's one of those really, really solid spells. There's just so much to it. And for damage, it's no slouch either. Necrotic damage has only 11 resistances and 11 immunities in the entire monster manual. Compare that to something like Fire or even Cold, which has a lot more resistances and immunities. Chill Touch is a spell that's going to be getting through a lot more often than Firebolt at its full damage. It's going to get through a lot more often than even Ray of Frost at its full damage, which is identical with a different style of utility. I would pair this with Ray of Frost or Firebolt or Eldritch Blast on your Warlock, but it's such a good damage cantrip that you should not look picking this up. Oh, and for the components for Chill Touch, I really like something like, wait right there, the grave drags you down. Our next spell is Chromatic Orb. Chromatic Orb is a sorcerer wizard spell and reads as thus. First level evocation, casting time of 1 action. Range of 90 feet, vocal, somatic, and material component. The material component being a material component with a monetary value, meaning you must have it, and it is a diamond worth at least 50 gold. And it has a duration of instantaneous. It just happens. You create a small sphere of energy, and you choose acid, cold, fire, lightning, or poison, or thunder. And then it does 3d8 damage if you hit your target with a ranged spell attack. And then you can upcast it for an additional d8 of damage for each level that you've cast it out. Chromatic Orb is fine, but it's nothing special. It does decent damage for a first level spell. And in those low levels, it can do a pretty significant chunk or just outright kill some enemies if you hit, which isn't something that should be overlooked. It also has a 90-foot range. If you are going to use Chromatic Orb, you should always use Thunder damage as your damage type of choice, because out of that list, it has the least resistances and vulnerabilities, at 14 resistances and 2 immunities in the entire monster manual. If you know about a Thunder resistance or immunity, or know about a vulnerability that the creature has, you have that option of switching that damage type to Thunder, but going in blind, Thunder should be your default damage type. The thing that makes this spell tough is the 50 gold focus component that is required to cast it. It's not consumed upon the casting of the spell, so you're not paying a 50 gold tax every single time to cast it, but you are paying a 50 gold fee for the privilege to cast Chromatic Orb. And for a spell that's not that good, 50 gold is 50 gold, and at first level, you're going to have trouble scrounging it together. At second level, it's going to be a pretty significant chunk of the gold that you have in your life so far. And once you get to higher levels like third, fourth, and fifth, it starts becoming a lot easier to scrape together that gold. But as you start to get closer and closer to fifth level, Chromatic Orb falls off and falls off and falls off as a decent option. Its damage just does not keep up. And it falls behind and therefore becomes something that you don't want to be using your spell slots on. So that 50 gold component as a barrier to entry at the lower levels and its damage falling off as a hamper from using it at the upper levels means there's a small window in which Chromatic Orb is good, and in that window it's solid, but it's also a tough sell for the rest of the levels of the game. So you might just look at some other options. Our next spell is a good one. It is Circle of Death. Circle of Death is a sorcerer, warlock, wizard spell, and reads as thus. It is a 6th level necromancy with a casting time of 1 action, a range of 150 feet, and vocal, somatic, and material component. The material component being the powder of a crushed black pearl, worth at least 500 gold. It has a duration of instantaneous. A sphere of negative energy ripples out in a 60-foot radius sphere. Each creature in this 60-foot radius sphere, which is huge, is going to make a Constitution saving throw versus 8d6 necrotic damage, taking half on a successful save. You can upcast it for 2d6 per level extra damage, so 10d6 at 7th, 12d6 at 8th, and 14d6 at 9th level. I think for its components, being vocal, somatic, and material, holding the black pearl in the one hand, going, "Let the chill of death taint my enemies. Call them to their graves." And create that little sphere with your hands. I like this spell a lot better on a wizard, and I like it even better on an NPC enemy. It does solid damage in a massive radius for a 6th level spell. And it targets con saves, which is a slightly lower save across the board than Dex by the statistics, and it means that evasion does not apply. So the few number of creatures that have evasion are not taking no damage by making the save, so it's always going to do something. But the thing that you have to think about with casting Circle of Death is how often is it overkill? How often do you need that 60-foot radius for the damage? And when using that 60-foot radius, how often, even if you can try to clip things, are you hitting things in that radius that you're not wanting to hit? It's such a gigantic hammer for problems that are often very small. In dungeons, this thing is useless. You don't have that 60-foot sightline to even avoid hitting yourself half the time. So how do you justify casting that? This spell is amazing when you step out onto a giant battlefield and you have just swaths of enemies and you just take out an entire battalion of people, which you can do with Circle of Death. But how often does that come up in your average campaign? If a lot, go for it. Otherwise, just think about Fireball. Yeah, Circle of Death targets a better save, and yeah, Circle of Death does a little bit better with creatures that have resistances and immunities, but Fireball is a 3rd level spell as opposed to a 6, and does the same damage in a smaller radius that's easier to hit a lot of things that you want to kill, but also easier to avoid a lot of things you don't want to hit. So it's one of those things that you need to evaluate. And in your campaign, think about all the situations you would use Circle of Death, and think about how many situations Fireball is just as good for a lower level spell slot, or upcast for more damage. Again, on a wizard, I think this is a lot better. You can have it in your spellbook. For a sorcerer and a warlock, using your spell known or your Mystic Arcanum, especially using your Mystic Arcanum, it's rough. You make yourself so you have no other options, and That's not something that I like to do on my casters, especially for a situational spell like Circle of Death. Our final spell is a little bit appropriate, Circle of Power, as the counter to Circle of Death. Circle of Power is a paladin spell, a 5th level abjuration. It has vocal components only, self with a radius of 30-foot range, and concentration up to 10 minutes. Energy radiates around you in that 30-foot radius, and until the spell ends, this energy moves with you. So wherever you move, you have a 30-foot radius aura around you for the Circle of Power. Creatures have advantage on saving throws versus spells or other magical effects, including you. And additionally, when an affected creature succeeds on a saving throw made against a spell or a magic effect that allows it to take half damage, it takes no damage instead. And unlike evasion, this works on every single save. So your con save against Circle of Death, Circle of Power actually allows you to evade all the damage, and it gives you advantage on the save to boot. For your components for Circle of Power, I think something like, by Torm's grace, ward my allies against the unholy spells of the enemy. This is a fantastic spell. It radiates out, gives your friends advantage on saves versus spells, and then allows them to take no damage instead of half. It's one of those things that it's not going to be good against every single enemy, but think about a lot of high-level combat, how many spells are being slung, and Circle of Power becomes just a great option to just get up, get going, and keep your party healthy. You can combine it with things like the Oath of the Ancients Paladin's aura against magic that gives half damage against spells, and you become an anti-magic monster that keeps your whole group from harm. Circle of Power is a very good spell, and as a paladin, you should at least know it's in your repertoire and be ready to prepare it whenever you think there's a chance of fighting high-level spellcasters. But that's the 7 spells that we're going to talk about today. If you enjoyed this, why not go check out the other podcast I do with my friend Audrey called Dear Dungeon. She's on a little bit of a hiatus right now, but we are still going with some fun guests, and each week you can get great advice on how to run your tabletop games or how to play in your tabletop games. We help solve disputes, we help answer problems, we help give mechanical advice, anything tabletop related that you can imagine, you can get an answer for. If you're interested in more of the stuff that I'm doing, you can follow me on Twitter at The Lost Samurai 7. And finally, to call out a little piece of media that I'm enjoying, it's something a little bit more popular than everything else that I'm doing, but it's something really come to enjoy. And that is the Modern Rogue YouTube channel. They haven't hit 1 million subscribers yet, so they're not like the super famous YouTubers. But it's Brian Brushwood and Jason Murphy. They each episode take looks at different aspects that would make a modern rogue. So aspects of being a gentleman and knowing food and beverage, aspects in being kind of a scoundrel and knowing different ways that spies can behave and knowing different ways that scammers can work across the internet and in modern times. They take a look at like different cons that have gone out throughout history, and looking at different things like best ways to defend yourself and how to make homemade weapons. They do it all through a lens of we're all learning together. They often bring on experts on the show because they don't know everything, and it's really, really fun. If you're looking for something that's good like that, I'd recommend checking out The Modern Rogue. But that's all that we have time for. I'll see you next week. Class dismissed.